They were starving, surrounded, and running out of bullets. Their own artillery was killing them faster than the enemy. For 6 days, no help came, but still not one man surrendered. This is the true story of the forgotten battalion. The men who held the line when the world believed they were already dead in the final autumn of 1918. When the Great War had already devoured millions and left Europe carved with trenches like open wounds, the American expeditionary forces prepared for their largest and most ambitious offensive, the Meuse Argonne push. It was meant to be the blow that would finally crack the German lines and force an end to the war. But to the men marching toward the Argonne Forest, none of that grand strategy mattered. All they knew was that they were entering a place soldiers whispered about an ancient wood so dense, dark, and unforgiving that even daylight struggled to reach the ground. Among the waves of troops pushing forward was the 77th Division, an American unit unlike any other. They were called the Melting Pot Division, a nickname earned not on the battlefield, but in the streets of New York City, where these men had come from tenements, factories, shipyards, and sweatshops. They spoke dozens of languages, prayed in different ways, and carried names that filled entire census pages with impossible spelling. Italians, Jews, Irishmen, Poles, Greeks, Russians, men who had arrived in America only years before now wore the same uniform and marched under the same flag. Most of them had never seen a forest like Argonne. Most had never seen war until arriving in France. Yet only days after stepping into this maze of ravines and ridgelines, they would find themselves alone, cut off, surrounded, and abandoned in one of the deadliest corners of the Western Front. Their story would not be one of sweeping victories or glorious charges. It would not be a tale of brilliant tactics or flawless planning. Instead, it would become a narrative carved out of desperation. A small band of men refusing to break, refusing to surrender, refusing to disappear even when the world seemed to forget them. For now, though, as the four clung to the ground and the artillery thundered in the distance, they were simply marching, unaware that they would soon enter a chapter of history where survival itself would become an act of defiance. They received their orders at dawn on October 2nd, 1918. The woods were still wrapped in a grey mist, the kind that blurred the edges of the world and made distances unreliable. Major Charles Whittlesey, a quiet, bookish New York lawyer turned reluctant commander, unfolded the message with the steady hands of a man who had already accepted that nothing about this war would ever be clear or simple. His battalion, just over 550 men, was to push forward through the Argonne, descend into the narrow Chalva ravine, and seize a position deep behind German lines. On paper, it was straightforward. In reality, it bordered on impossible. The plan assumed that the units on Whittlesey's left and right would advance at the same speed, keeping the front even and preventing the Germans from slipping behind them. It assumed that communication lines would hold, that the terrain would not swallow entire companies, and that the tangled undergrowth wouldn't grind their pace to a crawl. What the plan did not consider was the forest itself, its steep slopes, its thickets of thorn and oak, its natural choke points perfect for ambushes. Still, orders were orders. Whittlesey lifted his gaze to the men around him, grimy faces under steel helmets, rifles slung across aching shoulders, breathing clouds of steam into the morning air. Most were exhausted, some trembling, but all ready. When he gave the signal, they moved. The first hours went surprisingly well. They pushed downward through the ravine, exchanging scattered rifle fire with German outposts. A few prisoners were taken, and spirits rose. Some men even believed the German line was collapsing. They pressed on, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest, guided only by compasses and whatever visibility the canopy allowed. By midday, the battalion had reached the designated position farther than many American units had managed that day. But as the men dug shallow foxholes along the slope, Whittlesey began noticing something troubling. There was no sign of friendly forces on either side. No officers from neighboring regiments, no runners delivering updates, no lines of men appearing through the trees, only silence. He sent scouts up the ravine to check the flanks. Hours passed. No one returned. By late afternoon, fragments of information began drifting in from scattered runners. The left flank had stalled miles back. The right flank had been driven down by heavy machine gun fire. The units that were supposed to guard Witless's sides had never come close to keeping pace. The realization struck with the coldness of a blade. They were alone, and not only alone, they were far ahead of the American line, sitting in a pocket surrounded by high ridges where German troops were already beginning to regroup. Worse yet, when Whittlesey attempted to send word back through the forest, he discovered the first true disaster of the day. All phone lines had been cut. The dense terrain had swallowed his runners. Messages were not being returned. The walls of the ravine had become the walls of a trap. Whittlesey studied his map, knowing it offered no escape. There was only one thing he could do. He ordered his men to hold their position. Behind the gathering dusk, German rifles were already being raised. The night settled over the ravine like a tightening fist. As the last hints of daylight vanished behind the tree line, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds that did not belong to nature. Metallic clicks, hushed German voices carried across the slopes, the shifting of boots against leaves. The men of the 77th crouched low in their makeshift positions, gripping rifles that suddenly felt too small for the situation they were in. By sunrise on October 3rd, the trap had fully closed. The first German attack came just after dawn. Machine gun fire raked the lower slope, stitching the ground with bullets that kicked up dirt and splinters. Mortar shells thudded overhead, bursting among the trees and showering the men in bark and branches. Whittlesey's troops, outnumbered, exposed, lacking proper cover, fired back in controlled bursts. Several German soldiers fell, but for every attacker repelled, more seemed to take their place. It quickly became clear that the enemy now occupied the high ground on three sides. From those elevated ridges, the Germans could shoot down into the ravine as if aiming into a bowl. The men below had nowhere to move, nowhere to hide. Any attempt to withdraw would mean climbing uphill through open fire. Staying put meant enduring whatever the Germans unleashed next. Whittlesey chose to stay. His decision was not born of stubbornness, but necessity. Retreat was suicide. Holding their position, however desperate it seemed, was the only chance to survive long enough for the American line to catch up. If it ever did, attempts to re-establish communication began immediately. Runners were sent back through the woods, slipping into the thick brush carrying handwritten messages. None returned. Hours passed, then the entire day, with no word from anyone outside the ravine. The forest had devoured every man who tried to cross it, with the wires cut and the runners lost. There remained only one fragile thread of communication: the homing pigeons. Late in the morning, Whittlesey scribbled a message on a slip of paper and tied it to the leg of a pigeon. The bird burst into the air, wings beating hard, and disappeared into the canopy. It never arrived. Another was released after noon. It too vanished. All the while, the German pressure intensified. Supplies ran dangerously low. Many men had started the day with nothing more than a single can of rations stuffed into their haversacks. By afternoon, hunger hollowed their faces. Water was even more scarce. The only accessible stream lay in a shallow bend of the ravine, but the Germans understood its value. Anyone who tried to approach was met with a sudden crack of rifle fire. Painfully, the Americans realized their isolation was complete. Late that afternoon, the shelling paused long enough for a shouted message, carried across the ravine in heavily accented English. The voice was German, loud and confident, offering terms of surrender. They knew the Americans were trapped. They knew the lack of water, the dwindling ammunition, the hopelessness pressing down on the trapped battalion. The voice promised humane treatment, promised safety, promised that the Americans would not survive another day if they refused. The men looked to Whittlesey. He stood against a tree trunk, weary but unshaken. He was not a man given to dramatic words, and he did not deliver a speech. He simply raised his voice enough for his officers to hear. "We don't surrender," when the Germans shouted again, demanding an answer. Whittlesey refused to respond at all. He would not dignify the demand with a word. Night came again. It brought wind, cold, and the familiar whistle of shells passing overhead. The wounded groaned quietly in the dark, trying not to draw fire. The living tried to sleep in brief, shallow moments, only to be jolted awake by sudden bursts of gunfire, echoing of the ravine walls. By The time dawn bled into the treetops on October 4th. Many men felt they had aged years in a single night. Their faces were gaunt. Their eyes were hollow. Their hands shook from exhaustion, and still, no help had come. The last battalion was now truly lost, not in miles, but in the silence of a battlefield that no longer knew they were alive. By mid-morning on October 4th, the forest began to tremble with a new and far more terrifying kind of thunder. At first, the men thought it was another German barrage, but the shells were landing too close, too precisely, and in a pattern they recognized with sinking hearts. The explosions crept steadily toward their foxholes, tearing apart trees in violent bursts of orange and black dot. It wasn't the Germans. It was their own artillery. The realization rippled through the ravine in a wave of disbelief, then dread. The coordinates the battalion had sent the day before had been based on maps that were unreliable, distorted by the shifting front and the dense terrain. The officers in the rear, unable to confirm the battalion's location, were now firing blindly, believing they were hitting German positions. Instead, they were pounding Witless's men into the dirt. Shrapnel ripped through the undergrowth. One shell tore apart an entire group of foxholes, sending bodies and debris tumbling down the slope. Another detonated so close that the concussion stunned half a dozen men, leaving them deaf and bleeding from their ears. Panic surged through the lines as soldiers screamed for cover that didn't exist. Whittlesey watched the destruction with a level of composure that bordered on the unnatural. Inside, he felt the same terror and rage as his men, but he knew the only thing he could control was his next decision. They had to get a message through. If the artillery didn't stop, the Germans wouldn't have to attack. The American guns would finish the job for them. There were no runners left to send. The wires were still dead. That left only one grim possibility: the pigeons. Whittlesey motioned for the signaller to bring the last birds. Out of the handful they'd carried into the ravine, only one remained that could still fly. A small, dark, feathered homing pigeon known to the unit as "Cher ami, dear friend." The major knelt in the mud, under the rain of their own artillery, and scribbled a desperate note on a scrap of message paper. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He folded it, slid it into the tiny canister, and fastened it to Cher Ami's leg with fingers trembling from urgency rather than fear. As he handed the bird to the signaller, another shell ripped open the ground nearby, showering them with mud and splinters. There was no time to hesitate. Cher Ami burst into the air, beating her wings hard as she climbed above the treetops. For a moment, the men below watched her with something like prayer in their eyes. Hope, in this ravine, had become a fragile and unfamiliar thing. She barely made it 10 seconds before a German marksman on the ridge opened fire. A sharp crack echoed through the forest. Cher Ami jerked in midair, a spray of feathers spiraling behind her. She dipped, struggled, and then rose again, one wing ragged, her flight wobbling but still determined. More shots followed. One bullet tore through her chest. Another shattered her leg. Somehow she kept climbing, forcing herself forward with a kind of instinctive courage that no one in the ravine could see, but every man desperately needed to believe in. Minutes passed. The shelling continued. The trees shook. The ground erupted. Men huddled against the earth, praying not just for survival, but for a small bird carrying a message that might save them all. Then, slowly, the shells began to drift away. The explosions marched back up the hills, then farther still, until the forest fell into an eerie, trembling silence. Whether Cher Ami had made it all the way or another signal had alerted the artillerymen, the effect was the same. The barrage stopped in the sudden quiet. The men of the Lost Battalion looked at one another with the hollow eyes of people who had just glimpsed their own annihilation and watched it pass by inches. Relief washed over them, but it was a thin, temporary relief. They were still surrounded. They were still starving. And the Germans, sensing the chaos that had just played out, were not finished. Whittlesey knew this reprieve would not last. He ordered his officers to redistribute ammunition, to tend to the wounded with whatever scraps of cloth they could spare, and to prepare for another night under siege. Above them, smoke drifted through the trees like ghosts. Some were far behind the lines, bleeding, battered, and half dead. Share Army was still flying or crawling her message home, and inside the ravine. The men realized that if a wounded pigeon could fight her way through hell to reach help, then they, too, had no excuse to give up. The night after the friendly fire barrage was the worst yet. The forest seemed to twist itself tighter around the ravine, sealing off every path, except the one that led deeper into despair. Rain began to fall thin at first, then relentless, soaking uniforms, clogging rifles with mud, and turning the slopes into slick slides of clay. The wounded shivered uncontrollably. The living wrapped themselves in whatever scraps of fabric they could salvage. No one spoke unless they had to. Words took energy, and energy was something no one had in abundance. By dawn on October 5th, hunger had become a physical ache, sharp enough to make men dizzy. Some had not eaten in 2 days. Others rationed the last crumbs of hardtack in their pockets, sharing tiny pieces with the men too wounded to lift their heads. Every breath tasted of smoke, wet earth, and decay. Water posed an even greater danger. The only source, a narrow stream curling along the base of the ravine, was now a killing ground. German snipers had the entire bend of the stream sighted in. Anyone who tried to crawl to it risked taking a bullet the moment their helmet glinted in the light. Worse still, the men began to suspect that the enemy had thrown corpses into the water upstream. The foul smell and strange discoloration hinted at something unnatural. Yet thirst clawed at their throats. Some drank anyway, vomiting minutes later, then returning for more because nausea was easier to endure than dying of dehydration. Whittlesey ordered strict rationing, but he couldn't stop desperate men. He didn't blame them. He barely had the strength to stand himself. The Germans, having failed to force a surrender through bombardment, changed tactics. They slipped through the trees at odd hours, launching sudden assaults on the perimeter. Probing attacks meant to bleed the Americans one handful at a time. Grenades rolled down the slope. Rifle shots cracked from behind tree trunks. Machine guns sprayed bursts through gaps in the brush. The men of the 77th answered every attack with frantic, disciplined fire, but each clash drained their ammunition further. Corpsmen worked miracles with nothing. They used belts as tourniquets, bayonets heated over lighters to cauterize wounds, and rags torn from shirts to bandage shattered limbs. Some soldiers whispered quietly to the dying, telling them they would be home soon, telling them lies that were kinder than truth. All the while, death moved through the ravine with careless intimacy. It took men in the night when the cold became too much. It claimed others whose wounds had festered beyond saving. Some simply collapsed mid-sentence, their bodies too weakened to endure another hour. There was no time to bury them, no strength to carry them away. Bodies were laid gently beside the shallow foxholes, covered with blankets if a blanket could be spared, left with the promise that someone someday would return for them. Yet even in the midst of this misery, something unexpected happened. A strange, stubborn spirit began to seep back into the battalion. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was something rawer, more primal, a feeling that if they were going to die here, they would do so on their feet, rifles in their hands, facing the enemy that had trapped them. Morale didn't rise dramatically, but resignation hardened into determination. On the afternoon of October 5th, German soldiers approached the ravine under a makeshift white flag. The message they carried was another invitation to surrender couched in polite language, promising medical care and safety. They knew the Americans were starving, dehydrated, running out of ammunition. They believed another offer might finally break the trapped men's resolve. Whittlesey read the typed note without expression. The courier waited. The officers watched. The men held their breath. Whittlesey folded the message, tucked it into his pocket, and simply said, "I have no reply." The Germans called out again later, shouting that resistance was useless. Whittlesey refused to answer. Silence, cold, stubborn, unshakable, was his answer. By nightfall, the forest was alive with German movement. Flashlights flickered briefly in the distance, turning on and off like ghostly signals. Orders echoed across the ridgelines. The enemy was preparing something larger than their earlier probing attacks. Word whispered through the battalion. They would come again in the morning. Some men prayed. Some sharpened bayonets. Some lay awake listening to the rain, thinking of home, But not one asked to surrender, not one suggested giving up. They had survived the Germans. They had survived starvation. They had survived their own artillery. And if morning brought another battle, then morning would find them ready broken, starving, exhausted, but unbowed, deep in the forest, with no help yet in sight. The Lost Battalion dug in for whatever came next. The enemy came just after dawn, quietly at first, like a shifting of the forest itself. Then, without warning, machine guns erupted from 3 sides, stitching the ravine with fire. German grenades tumbled down the slopes, exploding among the tree roots and the makeshift shelters where the wounded lay. The forest, still heavy with fog, lit up in violent flashes. The men of the 77th were already awake. Few had truly slept. They sprang to the perimeter, firing from behind shattered logs, tree trunks, and shallow holes in the mud. Their ammunition was critically low, but adrenaline carried them, pushing their bodies beyond exhaustion. The Germans pressed hard, yelling as they charged through the gloom. Some reached the American lines and fought hand-to-hand, bayonet against bayonet, rifle stock against helmet. The ravine was so narrow that at times the fighting became a brutal, desperate crush of bodies. Mud and blood mixed beneath their boots. Witlessy moved along the line, stepping over fallen branches and nearly slipping on the steep ground. His uniform hung loosely from him. He had lost weight rapidly, but his voice remained steady. He shouted orders, encouraged men by name, pulled back those who were wounded, and dragged forward those still able to fight. Major George McMurtry, his second in command, fought through his own agony. A grenade blast the previous day had left shrapnel embedded in his limbs, and he was feverish from infection, but he refused to leave his post. He barked commands with the energy of a man who refused to acknowledge pain. And then the Germans brought flamethrowers. A hiss rose above the gunfire, followed by a roar as jets of fire shot across the ravine, setting trees ablaze and forcing the Americans to recoil from the heat. Flames curled around trunks. Smoke billowed through the fog. For a moment, panic trembled at the edge of every man's resolve. But the Germans advanced too boldly, certain that fire would break the line. The moment they exposed themselves, the remaining American machine gunners opened up short bursts, carefully aimed, preserving every precious round. Several flamethrower operators fell, their tanks erupting into pillars of fire that blazed even brighter than the weapons they carried. The assault wavered, sensing the shift. The Americans surged back to the line, firing with renewed fury. Finally, after nearly an hour of savage fighting, the Germans pulled away. Their shouts faded into the trees. The machine guns fell silent one by one. A strange quiet settled over the ravine. The fog drifted in again, carrying the smell of burnt wood and scorched earth. Men slumped where they stood. Some sobbed quietly, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. Others stared blankly at the trees, trying to process that they were still alive. Witlessy sank onto a fallen log. Mud clung to his boots and uniform. His hands trembled slightly, though he kept them hidden beneath his coat. Around him lay the consequences of the morning's battle, wounded men waiting for aid that might never come. Bodies of those who had fought their last fight, and the battered remnants of a battalion that had endured more in 5 days than many endured in an entire war. For a few minutes, nobody spoke. Then Private Abraham Krotoshinsky, a wiry, street-tough former boxer from Brooklyn, approached the officers, his face pale but determined. He had been listening to the faint, distant echoes of gunfire, the shifting patterns of artillery. Something in those sounds told him the American lines were closer than they had been days ago. "Sir," he said to Witlessy, "I think I can make it through the German lines." Every man around him looked up. The forest seemed to pause. Attempting to slip through the encirclement was a death sentence. 2 runners had already tried and vanished. Another had returned with bullet wounds that killed him minutes later. The Germans had tightened their perimeter with every passing day. But Krotoshinsky waited. Eyes steady, Witlessy studied him for a long moment. He wanted to say no. He wanted to protect the man, just one more life already pushed to the brink by impossible circumstances. But the battalion was out of choices. Reinforcements might be near, but no one could say when they would break through. If they didn't get word out soon, the Lost Battalion might not last another night. "Go," Witlessy said softly. And good speed. Krotoshinsky nodded once. He collected a map, a scrap of food, a canteen with a few sips of muddy water, and the blessing of every man who watched him crawl toward the edge of the ravine. As he slipped into the trees, disappearing like a shadow among the pines. The entire battalion held its breath for hours afterward. Men paused between firefights to listen, hoping to hear a signal flare, distant gunfire. Anything that meant Krotoshinsky had made it through, but the forest remained silent. The German lines remained unbroken. The men settled back into their foxholes, waiting for nightfall, waiting for the next attack, waiting for hope to rise from the shadows, or for the sound of a gunshot in the distance telling them their last messenger had failed. Time dragged on. The Lost Battalion, battered and bleeding, dug in once more. Rescue was coming. It had to be. But until it arrived, they would hold the line, just as they always had. Night fell slowly on October 6th, sliding over the ravine like a curtain drawn by an unsteady hand. The fires left by the morning's flamethrowers still smoldered in patches, casting pockets of orange glow that pulsed weakly between the trees. A cold wind swept in, carrying the smell of ash and something metallic and sour blood. Rust fear. Whittlesey forced himself to stay awake. His eyelids felt like sandbags, heavy and uncooperative, but he couldn't surrender to sleep. Too many depended on him. He moved from group to group, checking the wounded, reassuring the living, offering a hand on a shoulder or a quiet word that felt painfully insufficient. He could feel the brittle edge in his voice, the exhaustion creeping into every syllable, but the men never showed it if they noticed. They needed him to be unbreakable. As he was, McMurtry, in agony from his wounds, stayed alert beside him. Sweat soaked his collar despite the cold. Every step he took left a smear of blood in the mud. But he refused to sit. "We're close," he rasped. "I can hear it. The guns. Ours. They're closer than yesterday," Whittlesey nodded. He had heard it to the faint, distant thumping of American artillery searching for a breakthrough in the valley. But the forest had fooled them before. Sound twisted strangely among the ridge lines, echoing in ways that made hope easy to mistake for truth. Hours passed. A few men collapsed from exhaustion, falling asleep mid-sentence. Others sat staring into the darkness, unable to rest, afraid that closing their eyes would mean never opening them again. Ammunition was nearly gone. Rations were gone entirely. Many resorted to chewing leaves just to keep their jaws moving, to ease the emptiness clawing at their stomachs. Not far from the aid station, little more than a tarp stretched over two branches, Captain Nelson Haldeman lay pale and shivering. His leg was shattered, and 2 more bullets had lodged in his shoulder and hip. He drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling orders, the battlefield replaying itself behind half-closed eyes. Yet even wounded, even delirious, he refused to be carried to shelter. He insisted on lying where he could hear the men, where he could bark commands whenever clarity returned. He had become one of the battalion's pillars, broken, blooded but immovable. Shortly after midnight, a strange rustling rose from the northern slope. The sound was too soft to be boots trampling leaves, too uneven to be the march of a patrol. It came in short bursts, then silence, then whispers of movement again. Riflemen tensed. Bayonets gleamed faintly as they were fixed to muzzles. The Germans were becoming bolder. Flare arced into the sky, blood-red light splashing across the ravine and revealing dark figures creeping through the brush. The enemy had chosen the darkest hour to probe the lines again. "Hold your fire," Whittlesey whispered. Not yet. The Germans inched closer, silhouettes shifting, helmets catching flashes of the flare's dying light. Then one of them tripped over a root and cursed under his breath. Now, the ravine exploded with gunfire, short controlled bursts from rifles and machine guns, exactly as Whittlesey had drilled them. Men who moments earlier were barely able to stand suddenly fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves. The Germans scattered. Some returned fire, others ducked behind trees. The exchange lasted barely 10 minutes, but to the exhausted men it felt like an hour when the final shot echoed away. The forest fell silent again save for the groans of the newly wounded. The men didn't cheer. There was no triumph left in them. Only the hollow relief of having survived another assault, another test of nerves and will. Whittlesey moved through the lines, counting heads, calling names, checking the fallen. His voice cracked only once a private he had spoken with just hours before now lay lifeless, staring up at the branches. He closed the soldier's eyes with two muddy fingers. "You held," he whispered. "That's all anyone could ask." Not long after, McMurtry pointed to the sky. "Look." A new flare rose, this one distant. Too distant to be German, American. The men watched it with a mixture of disbelief and raw yearning. A signal, a sign that someone out there was still fighting toward them. But no footsteps followed. No artillery shift broke the German lines. No shouted commands echoed up the ravine. It was hope, nothing more. But to starving, wounded men in the darkness, hope could be a dangerous thing to bright. Too fragile. Witlessy felt every pair of eyes turning to him, searching his expression for meaning. "They're coming," he said softly. He didn't know if it was true, but he had to give them strength, even if only a teaspoon of it remained inside him. "They're close now." The men nodded slowly, as if absorbing the words into their very bones. Some lay back and forced their breathing to steady. Others rechecked their rifles. A few looked toward the distant flare still fading in the sky. No one surrendered to despair. Not tonight. Near dawn, the forest grew quiet again to quiet. No German movements, no artillery. Even the wind died. Witlessy felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Something was changing, whether it meant salvation or destruction. He could not yet tell, but the next hours would decide the fate of the Lost Battalion, and whether any of them would ever leave the forest alive. Dawn on October 7th arrived without color, only a pale, washed-out gray that seeped between the trees like a dying breath. The fog drifted low and heavy, muffling every sound, turning the ravine into a world of blurred shapes and uneasy silence. The men woke slowly, not with the sharp alertness of soldiers in danger, but with the sluggish stiffness of bodies pushed well beyond their limits. It had been 6 days since they were cut off. 6 days of hunger, thirst, bombardment, and unbroken combat. 6 days of wondering whether the next moment would be their last. The stillness that morning was unnatural. Too calm, too quiet. Witlessy listened for signs of movement, boots on leaves, whispered orders, the clatter of rifles, but the forest offered nothing. Even the regular crack of German snipers had stopped. McMurtry limped toward him, leaning heavily on a shattered rifle he used as a cane. He spoke through clenched teeth, his voice thin with pain. "Either they're regrouping," he said, "or something's happened." Witlessy nodded. He had the same suspicion, but no confirmation, no messenger, no information. Only instinct, and instinct alone couldn't save the battalion. The hours crawled by. The men waited, every sense sharpened by dread. Some whispered that maybe the Germans had withdrawn. Others believed a new assault was coming, one bigger than anything before. Even the wounded seemed to hold their breath, as if movement might break the delicate balance holding the world in place. Around mid-morning, a faint sound rose from beyond the northern ridge. She first. No one knew what it was. A murmur, maybe. A low tremor. Men leaned forward, straining to hear. Then the sound came again, clearer this time. Gunfire. Close, not the sporadic, sharp shots of German patrols. This was heavier, chaotic, rolling across the trees in waves. Rifles, machine guns, even distant shouts. And beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the rhythmic pounding of American mortars. The fight was coming toward them. Private Krotoshinsky, if he was still alive, had reached the lines. The relief forces were pushing forward. For the first time in days, a spark ran through the men. Shoulders straightened, eyes sharpened. Rifles were lifted and checked with trembling hands. It wasn't cheering, none had the strength for that, but the ravine vibrated with a fragile, almost painful hope. But the Germans heard it too. They reacted with a fury born of desperation. Within minutes, their forces surged down the slopes again, crashing through the brush in a violent attempt to overwhelm the battalion before help could arrive. Machine guns poured fire into the ravine. Mortar shells crashed against the ridge. Screams echoed between the trees. The Lost Battalion, starving and low on ammunition, fought like men possessed. Some fired single, careful shots to conserve bullets. Others, out of ammunition entirely, used bayonets and rifle butts. One man fought with a rock in his hand. Another wielded an entrenching tool like an axe. The wounded propped themselves against trees and fired with trembling arms, refusing to lay down while their friends were still fighting. Haldeman, barely conscious, forced himself upright and shot a German soldier who had breached the perimeter, then collapsed again with the rifle still in his hands. Witlessy moved along the line, shouting orders over the roar of gunfire. A bullet tore through the brim of his helmet, knocking it from his head. He didn't even flinch. He snatched the helmet from the mud and kept moving. The Germans pressed harder, screaming as they charged. Grenades rolled down the slopes. Bark exploded from trees. The forest dimmed with smoke and dust. Still the line held. Still the men refused to break. Time lost meaning inside the chaos. Minutes felt like hours, hours like moments. The battalion fought until arms burned, until vision blurred, until the edges of consciousness wavered dangerously. Then suddenly the German fire slackened. Not a retreat. Not yet, but something had changed. Witlessy found himself crouched behind a stump, chest heaving, ears ringing. He listened, trying to distinguish the shifting rhythm of battle, and then he heard it, the unmistakable clatter of American bars. Closer than before, a ripple swept through the forest shouts. Movement, the thud of boots in the undergrowth. German officers barked orders, trying to reposition their men, but the tide was turning. The sound of battle was coming from behind the German line now. The encirclement was collapsing. Witlessy stood, swaying for a moment before steadying himself. McMurtry came to his side, his face streaked with blood and dirt. "Sir," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Witlessy looked out across the ravine at the wounded struggling to sit up, at the men leaning on rifles, at the bodies of those who had given everything. "Hold the line," he called out. His voice was barely louder than the wind, but every man heard it. Hold. Just a little longer. The Germans fired one last volley wild. Panicked shots meant to buy time, but it was over. Their line buckled. Their shouts grew distant. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an American soldier yelled a command that echoed through the trees. Advance. The relief had reached them. The Lost Battalion was not yet safe, but for the first time in 6 days, survival was no longer a fading hope. It was coming toward them, rifles blazing, boots pounding the promise that they had not been forgotten.